Hey GM everyone, welcome to Gasless, the podcast that explores crypto and Web3 from a multi-chain perspective. Is the emergence of move-based smart contracts just hype, or is there real innovation taking place? In this episode, we dive into things Move, Aptos, and Sui with trades from Figment Capital. All right, I think it'll be nice to sort of go back in time a little bit and hear a little bit about your personal story, like how did you encounter crypto and then how did you end up finding yourself at Figment Capital? I'm sorry.
Y- yeah, sure. And it's great to be here. Just before we start, I just need to say that obviously everything I say here is just my personal view and not necessarily the views of Figment Capital, and that like nothing I say here is investment advice. But in terms of my personal story, so I got into crypto. I was in school at the time, and everything was locked down because of COVID. So all my classes were online. I wasn't having particular fun with online classes, and I had a lot of free time to just explore the internet. And so I was just watching YouTube videos, just like learning about random stuff, and just stumbled on some crypto videos about Bitcoin, and thought it was kind of interesting. Decided to put some money into Bitcoin. Of course, I had heard about it at the time, but never spent any significant amount of time talking about it. Um, and so ended up buying some Bitcoin, buying some Ethereum, and of course this was in like April of 2020, right after COVID hit, and so these coins were extremely cheap,
Mm,
and they basically immediately went up a ton. And naturally, when you make a lot of money in something, you get more interested in it. And
yeah.
so I started spending a bit more time reading about it, bought a little bit more, and then it kept going up like throughout the entire summer. And then it got to like late 2020, and crypto had been basically up only. And so I just decided to, allocate a significant amount of my time reading about crypto, thinking about crypto, learning about it. And then, this was my senior year of undergrad, and it had gotten to the
Mm-hmm.
point in early 2021 where I was spending almost all my free time learning about crypto. And previously, I'd been planning on becoming a machine learning engineer.
Mm-hmm.
But given how much time I was spending on crypto, I decided, maybe I should pursue this crypto thing instead. And so I started exploring what options I had, and thought maybe transitioning from a machine learning engineer to a smart contract dev would be an easy natural transition. And so I started applying to different like internships while I was still in school to see if I could land a position as a Solidity dev or something. And just while I was doing that, saw an opening at a venture fund. Um, and at the time didn't have it on my radar, but thought it looked kind of interesting, so applied. Didn't expect much of it, and just through that ended up stumbling in a position as intern at a family office doing crypto venture investing. Worked there for a few months, and then was going to a crypto conference and hanging around networking with people, and ended up running into someone at the team at Figment Capital. I was looking for a position at the time. They were hiring for a position at the time. It just ended up being a good fit. And
Yeah.
so, that was 4 or 5 months ago. And that's how I ended up here at Figment Capital.
And Figment Capital, I can see, is like an infrastructure provider and also staking validated services provider. And but they also dabble in like seed stage investing, right? And is that what you were focusing on?
Yeah, so there's two entities here. So there's Figment, which we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes call Figment Inc. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
Figment Capital. So Figment Inc.
Mm-hmm.
is a large enterprise grade infrastructure provider.
I
So
see.
they run infrastructure on like 60 different proof of stake blockchains. Um, they provide staking services for institutional clients. And then they have another service called Data Hub, which is an API service for people who want to read and write to the different blockchains. And then we have Figment Capital, which
Mm.
is associated with Figment, which is a venture fund that focuses on Web3 infrastructure investments. So that's where I work. And we invest infrastructure quite broadly. So this includes new L1s, the modular blockchain stack, middleware, so things like bridges and oracles, UX
Mm.
solutions, privacy, ZK tech, anything like that. So really everything outside of the application layer, anything that makes applications more scalable, more powerful, easy to use. Uh, that's sort of our core focus at Figment Capital.
All right. Um, you have a term on your Twitter profile that describes yourself as long-termist. What do you mean by that, and why is it important to you?
Yeah, so long-termism at a high level is the view that the future could be quite long. The future of civilization could last for millions or even billions of years. And if
Mm,
it does, then the number of people who exist in the future will be extremely large, right? It's potentially, if not more.
yeah.
And it's also based on the insight that there are things we can do today that have impact on how the long-term future goes. And so when we think about the significance of how big the future could be, and how much of an impact we can have on that future, when deciding what actions we should take, one of the biggest considerations should be how it'll impact that long-term future. And so that perspective or that philosophy, and it's
I
one
see.
of the central components of my worldview. It's not
I see.
extremely relevant to my crypto investing on a day-to-day basis, but it's something in
Mm,
the back of my head that I constantly think about.
okay. All right. Then I guess, what prompted you to talk about the, the emergence of Move and the new layer one blockchains on your, what prompted you to create those threads recently? Mm,
Yeah, so both at Figment and Figment Capital, we're constantly thinking about what are the next blockchains, right? What major
mm,
developments are we seeing? Where do we think the industry is heading? Um,
mm,
and what we noticed is that we've been looking at Aptos and Sui for quite a while, um, and we noticed that a lot of investors, a lot of builders were quite excited about Sui and Aptos as well. But there's quite a bit of information asymmetry. It hadn't quite spread to the average retail investor or crypto user what was so exciting or novel about these new blockchains. And we wanted to kind of break some of that information asymmetry and
mm.
just publish at a level of depth that we could actually talk about specifics and why someone should really be interested in these blockchains, but still keeping things high level enough that it was accessible to a mainstream audience. And
Mm.
so the objective with those threads was just to spread the word on what we found interesting and exciting about Aptos and Sui.
And what did you find, what piqued your interest with with Move and Aptos and Sui? Like, what excited you guys?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things. Speaking quite vaguely, both of these blockchains are some of the highest performance blockchains that we've seen. So,
Mm,
for context, both of them came out of DM. So the DM project was a project led by Facebook for this super high performance permission blockchain
yeah.
that, because of like regulatory reasons, wasn't ever really able to see the light of day. So DM was disbanded by Facebook at with the beginning of last year. And so all these world-class engineers, world-class cryptographers, world-class research scientists had been working on this project for 2 or 3 years, made a number of really exciting technical breakthroughs, and then just had their project scrapped for regulatory reasons. And they kind of
Mm,
looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, the tech is still here, right? We have this open source code, we've made these innovations, we just can't do it through Facebook. And so a lot of them left and took those core technologies and iterated on them in different ways to release them to a broader audience that wasn't able to use that technology at Facebook. And the two main projects that spun out from DM were Miston Labs, which is building Sui, and Aptos
yeah.
Labs, which is building Aptos.
Mm,
So, just before we even looked at the technology, we were quite excited because these were world class teams that had already built 3/4 of a world class blockchain, and now just
mm,
needed to iterate it for a permissionless environment and make a few other
mm,
modifications. And then when we looked at the technology, we looked at the performance, we looked at how many transactions it could support, just how quick it was able to finalize these transactions. And you know, I think even though Solana is quite controversial to many people, they see how it's differentiated from something like Ethereum or something like Avalanche. These
Mm-hmm.
like really fast blockchains have a bunch of really interesting use cases. And so, we found Sui and Aptos quite compelling from a performance perspective. And then we started to dive into Move. It's, the programming language that both of them use, and got even more excited. So Move was the programming language that was used or intended for use by the DM blockchain. It was designed at DM specifically for that blockchain.
Yeah.
And since both of these projects are XDM, they decided to just keep that programming language, and each of them made different modifications for it for their specific chain. But there's two key things that are really interesting about Move. So the first is that it's really optimizing for safety. Right now, we're seeing in the smart contract landscape, especially in Solidity environments, that it's really difficult to secure smart contract code. And the consequences of that are hundreds of millions of dollars in exploits, like seemingly every month.
Yeah.
Not all of those are because of smart contract vulnerabilities. Maybe they're like governance attacks or something. But still, it's really hard to secure these smart contracts. So when we see a new language that comes up that was designed from the ground up to make it as easy as possible to write smart contract code securely, that's something that's quite exciting to us. And then the second thing is that quite expressive. By that I mean when you're reasoning about how to write Move code, it's much easier to reason about and to express some specific concept or action than it is for a language like Solidity. And so, like Sui, for example, is quite focused on not exclusively, but is focused on gaming applications, NFT applications, different what I would think of as like crypto social or cultural applications, where you'll have these dynamic NFTs, you'll have these in-game items, and it's really important to be able to quickly be able to reason about changing those items, combining them, breaking them apart, destroying them, and that's quite easy to do in a Move programming paradigm, and is much easier to do than something like a Solidity paradigm. So, we think these blockchains are interesting because they're high performance and because they have this really interesting, safe and expressive programming language.
I see. What aspect of Move specifically um, distinguishes it from Solidity? You mentioned a couple of use cases like the social NFTs and the gaming application, but is there some way to describe, like, they often mention like object oriented, Move turns everything into an object. Like, how would you translate this into, say, layman's terms? Like, what really distinguishes Move from Solidity?
Yeah, so both of these languages are fully generalizable, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
can build pretty much whatever you want in either. But the question
Mm-hmm.
is, how easy is it to build whatever you're trying to build? And then
Mm-hmm.
how safe is it, or how easy is it to build whatever you're trying to build safely, right, without any
I
exploits?
see. I see.
So in Move, especially in Sui Move, which I'm more familiar with, you can essentially create these objects,
Mm-hmm.
and then those can be whatever you want. Maybe it's a sword for your game, maybe it's some sort of NFT profile picture, and then this stands as like a standalone digital object that you can
Mm-hmm.
then perform some sort of computation with. So for example, say I have a soldier as an
Mm-hmm.
NFT, and I have a
Mm-hmm.
sword as an NFT, and I have a shield as an NFT. I can
Yeah.
write a function that is essentially like equip soldier or something. And what that function will
Uh-huh.
do is it takes the sword, it takes the shield, it combines it with the soldier NFT, and now you have like an armed soldier NFT that gets returned by that function.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so if you're thinking about gaming, or
Mm.
some gaming studio that wants to build something, it's like really
Mm.
easy, relatively speaking, to build these sort of dynamic NFT applications in a Move paradigm relative to something like Solidity, which you can do that in Solidity. You can do something similar in Solidity, but it's like just much harder and less intuitive to build that type of
So
functionality.
that's the light bulb moment. Like, it's honing in on NFTs, which is really, this huge. I think one of the we can confidently say, like, the if anything that'll succeed, it'll be NFTs, right? Because DeFi still has a regulatory um, hump to try to get over. But then, with NFTs and gaming, and then now dynamic NFTs, that really is the niche in which move-based layer ones can play in. You see.
Yeah, and of course, they can support DeFi applications. I expect both
Mm-hmm.
Sui and Aptos to have fairly vibrant DeFi ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
But I am really excited about Move, especially for gaming and dynamic NFT applications.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I think a lot of things in crypto probably will work,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of them probably also won't. And
Mm.
DeFi, of course, is in this fairly vulnerable, pivotal moment right now
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the tornado cash situation.
Yeah.
But wherever DeFi goes, whether it succeeds or not, wherever other crypto applications go, I'm quite confident that NFTs in the long run, in
Yeah.
some capacity, will be
Yeah.
around. And
Yeah.
the best platform that I've seen for NFTs is probably Sui and the Move programming language.
Wow. You mentioned that in the EVM paradigm, we'll likely see exploits in the billions of dollars because Solidity requires more time and resources to prevent X. Okay, we did cover this already, just
Yeah, but
now.
but it might be worth elaborating on.
Okay.
So this is from a tweet I wrote a while ago,
Mm.
and it's basically just linearly extrapolating from where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we see pretty consistent 8 and 9 figure exploits in Solidity.
Yep.
Of course, we see this sometimes in like other blockchains, like in the Solana ecosystem as well, which is all those contracts are written in Rust. But if things don't radically change um, on the EVM in Solidity, in these different EVM blockchains, which to some extent I expect them to change. In other ways, I expect them to not change. Um, as these systems grow, the amount of value that's being secured in these smart contracts is also going to increase.
Yeah.
And so, unless you think that we're somehow going to like categorically solve for exploits in smart contracts, which is like clearly not going to happen,
Yeah.
then we're going to see a world where smart contracts that are securing $10 billion get exploited, and the hacker
Mm-hmm.
runs away with a 10-figure sum,
Yeah.
which I think is just totally unacceptable, right? Like nobody thinks that's okay, but ask, okay, well, what needs to happen for that to not occur? I think we need better like auditing practices. I think we need to scale smart contracts slower and more stably, past some specific like TVL. But we can also move to a new smart contract framework that is just like fundamentally safer, right? That just fundamentally shrinks the attack surface area. That categorically eliminates entire classes of smart contract vulnerabilities. And Move does
Mm-hmm.
that. There are a few other programming languages that I think do something similar. And I think that's a really important development as we scale up all of crypto and as it stores more and more value.
Let's dive into Aptos and Sui separately, and then maybe do, compare and contrast. So you called Aptos the layer one for everyone. Why did you give it this tagline?
Yeah, so this is actually the slogan that they use for themselves.
I see.
So
Okay.
yeah, so it's not specific to me, but I think what they're trying to get at is that
Mm-hmm.
all these blockchains are permissionless to interact with. All of them, all these general purpose blockchains allow you to write whatever application you want as a developer, but
Mm-hmm.
most of them can't support everyone, right? Like not everyone can use Ethereum, especially in the bull market. So, Aptos with its scalability that it currently has in its scalability roadmap is really designed for mainstream adoption, right? Being able to support hundreds of millions or billions of people. That's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of scale that it requires. We'll see if it can get to that point. But
Mm-hmm.
its ethos and its spirit is being an accessible blockchain for everybody.
And how, like, so how would the average person compare it, say, with Solana, for instance? Because I don't think you should compare it with Ethereum, but how would Atos position itself against Solana?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it depends on like what vantage point you're taking, right? So like, how
Mm-hmm.
is it different from users is a different question. From how it's different for developers is a different question. From how Aptos and the Solana teams are thinking about each one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe taking the user's perspective first.
Okay.
Um, it's a bit hard to say, right? Because Aptos isn't launched yet. We don't know what application is going to be at launch in 1 to 2 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that to some extent, like most of the complexity under the hood is going to be attempted to be abstracted away from users, and both the Solana ecosystem and the Aptos ecosystem are going to try to make it as seamless, as simple, as intuitive as possible for users to use either blockchain.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know how much of this is going to come downstream to users, other than like very simple things like, um, how fast do these transactions feel? How expensive are these transactions? What interesting things can I do on these blockchains?
Yeah.
Maybe like one little interesting thing about Aptos is that they're working on this tool for pre-execution, which means that if you have some MetaMask or some um, Phantom wallet and you're on Solana and you're trying to execute some transaction, oftentimes what you're doing is you're signing some smart contract code to run, but
Mm-hmm.
you don't really know, like really under the hood, you're not reading that code to make sure it does what you think it does, right? And so it's possible that you're signing some malicious contract and then you just get wrecked because they like steal your
Yeah.
funds or something.
Yeah.
So pre-execution is this thing that is playing with, where before you actually execute a transaction in your wallet, you can run this like simulate transaction that will then run that computation and tell you, okay, what would the output of this transaction be before you actually
Mm-hmm.
run that transaction.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like super interesting for helping protect users, for giving like a better user experience, so they know like, oh, if I buy this NFT, like what would that look like in my wallet? Or if I combine these two
Mm-hmm.
NFTs into this new, like, third NFT, like what would that look like? I think that's quite interesting. And it'll be interesting
Mm-hmm.
to see how applications integrate with pre-execution, or wallets integrate with pre-execution to give a better, safer user experience.
Mm-hmm.
To my knowledge, this isn't something that Solana can support. Pre-execution, of course, is like quite limited in what it can do, because of course there are ways that malicious contracts can still trick pre-execution. Say
Yeah.
like every other contract, like every other time somebody runs your contract, you do some sort of exploit. So when they simulate it, it does like the legitimate thing, and then the next time it exploits you when you actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are ways to game this, and of course, like whenever you go and actually execute the transaction, it might do something different than when you simulated it, because it was it executed at a later time. Um, but still, at a high level, I think it's a cool tool, and that's something unique to Aptos for users. Other than that, though, I do expect from the user perspective, it's just going to be a race for very simple metrics like speed, um, price of transactions, and then maybe
Yeah.
like what you can actually do on these blockchains.
Yeah. And so, from the developer's perspective, I bet it's security is going to be the major reason why they want to onboard to Aptos, right?
Yeah, so I think they're looking at the the Move programming language, comparing it to Solana's Rust framework, thinking
Mm-hmm.
about how easy would it be to develop an application in each of these languages, and
Yeah.
then also just how secure they would be able to make some contract in Move uh, versus like Rust on Solana. I think like another key thing for reasoning about how developers will think about these chains is, are they just now entering crypto and they're deciding
Mm-hmm.
whether to build on Solana or Aptos or Sweet for that
Mm-hmm.
matter? Or are
Mm-hmm.
they already on Solana and they're now thinking about transitioning to Move and to the Move blockchains? Because when you're
Okay.
new to an ecosystem, you already have to learn a new programming language. You're starting from scratch and you're
Yeah.
just deciding between A and B, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a developer already on Solana, you've already written some code, you're already probably familiar with that framework, and now you're thinking, okay, should I start from scratch or start near from scratch to transition to this other blockchain, right? The switching costs are
Yeah.
much higher.
Yeah.
So, I think both of those two classes of developers are also thinking about things quite differently. I expect that fewer people who are already like building on Solana will transition to Aptos or Sui relative to the number of people who are entering the ecosystem and deciding between Solana versus Sui or Aptos.
Mm-hmm. Which L1 do you think has the least inertia to onboard developers who are coming from, say, the Web2 world?
Do you mean like?
Solidity.
Oh, I see. So you mean like between all L1s, not between like just Sui and Aptos?
Yeah, so this is a slightly general question. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I don't know if I have the best answer for this because I haven't
Okay.
spent an extensive time programming or like using the developer tools for every single major L1. My
Mm-hmm.
suspicion
Mm-hmm.
is that it's probably easiest for Ethereum, and
Okay.
it's probably like almost as easy for any EVM chain. It just has the most documentation.
I
The tutorials
see.
are quite easy. Solidity is very difficult to write securely, but in terms of the
Uh-huh.
actual syntax, it's like fairly straightforward to pick up if you've ever
Mm-hmm.
used like JavaScript or Java or C or anything like that.
I
So
see.
it's quite easy to learn Solidity. The problem is that then when you go to actually write some sophisticated contract, there's a bunch of things you
Mm-hmm.
have to worry about. And
I
depending on your
see.
application, it might be a bit counterintuitive, how exactly you need to functionality. But still, there's a reason why a lot of people talk about the EVM and Solidity's network effects, about
Mm-hmm.
how it's quite difficult for new programming languages to emerge, because why would
Yeah.
somebody want to use some new programming language that doesn't have all this developer tooling relative to something like Solidity, which has been established and has had its toolkit built out for years.
Now let's dive into Sui. What what are you seeing in Sui, and how is it different from Aptos?
Yeah, so I guess there's a bunch of interesting things about Sui. Maybe just interesting thing to me is that of all the blockchains that I see, and this is in
Mm-hmm.
rollups, it is the best blockchain I've seen to support applications. So this is gaming, this is NFTs,
Mm-hmm.
this is decentralized social media. I think all of these are kind of, with the exception of very trivial NFT applications, all of these are still nascent, like open
Really?
grass. We haven't
So
really
you
seen
wouldn't
any
you would
compelling crypto games.
no, so you were saying that this will take over that whole niche, and um yeah, I think I will reserve my question for later. Continue.
Okay, yeah. So it's not that I think that Sui will win all of crypto culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's still going to be very vibrant NFT, maybe even gaming ecosystems on other blockchains.
Yeah.
But it's that if I just think about what do crypto game developers in a blockchain, what do dynamic NFT builders want in a blockchain? I think Sui is
Mm-hmm.
the so it has very fast transaction execution. If you're doing simple token transfers, it's basically instantaneous. It has this really interesting data model and modification of Move that makes it very intuitive to reason about and express uh, concepts related to dynamic NFTs and gaming
Mm-hmm.
applications. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're a gaming developer and you want to build some world class crypto game, you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about what blockchain to build on, what programming language to build on, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're investing tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on building this world class game, you really don't care whether your developers know Solidity already or not, because it's
Yeah.
worth you using whatever the best language in the blockchain are, even if there's some sort of switching cost associated with that. You want to use the best technology. And I think Sui is that best technology, right? So I expect all the best games to be built on Sui, which is pretty cool. Yes, that's like the most exciting thing to me about Sui. But of course, it's still a general purpose blockchain. And because, as I mentioned, it has this ability to execute simple token transfers basically instantaneously, it could also be useful or interesting as a payments platform. So if you think about like Solana Pay, you could have a fairly competitive alternative to that built on Sui. So, we'll see where developers go and what ideas get tested out on Sui, but I'm most excited about it from this crypto culture perspective.
And so based on what you mentioned, I guess then I can conclude that would you say that you're more optimistic about Sui than Aptos?
Don't know if I want to take a position on that.
Okay.
To an extent, it might be too early to tell. One way that I think about, so I've talked about how I think about Sui as this crypto culture chain and the best crypto culture chain that we've seen. I think of, and that's a bit of a simplification, but at a high level, I think that's like the comparative advantage that Sui has.
Yeah.
Aptos, by contrast, I think of as being Solana 2.0,
Yeah.
not in that it's a Predo improvement over Solana, but that really all the arguments use a chain like Solana, most of them are stronger arguments for why you'd want to use something like Aptos. So, it has really good performance. It has, one of the lowest latencies that it has pretty compelling parallel transaction execution. And then it has, all these like interesting, cool features like very quick blockchain sync time, this pre-execution thing I was talking about. They're working on what they call homogeneous state sharding, which is just a way of scaling the blockchain further. So a very interesting scaling roadmap as well. So I'm thinking of Aptos more as like a Solana 2.0 chain. I think because of that, maybe it's going to see, and because of its unique, features, that it's probably going to see a more vibrant DeFi ecosystem than Sui. We'll have to see. So then I'm thinking about, for these monolith L1s, how is the DeFi ecosystem going to unfold, or how are the Solana DeFi ecosystem, how is that going to compete with Aptos' ecosystem? But if you buy the monolithic L1 thesis, then I think those are the two biggest chains to watch from a DeFi perspective.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn. On one hand, I think liquidity is key. So the chain that has strong DeFi has kind of a moat around it. But on the other hand, I also think culture is important. And I think for example, if you took, let's just say, I mean, I could be wrong here, but let's just say if I took Solana versus Avalanche, for example, Solana really, I think, surprised everyone by taking a lot of market share with NFTs. And I think that's where culture is. And I think that's what's keeping them still relevant at the moment. I don't know. Do you see it from the same lens?
Yeah, I think culture, relatively speaking, is one of the most exogenous applications of crypto, meaning DeFi is pretty much only used by insiders, right? If it's used by outsiders, it's abstracted away, and the users just putting their assets into something like Celsius. Not anymore, but previously, like that's what they were doing. They didn't know how to use it, so they just gave their money to somebody else and let them do DeFi for them.
Yeah.
These culture applications, I think right now and in the future, are going to be used by outsiders who don't know anything about crypto. They don't care. They just want to flex their profile picture to their friend, or just express themselves some way, to play these like status games, or to play these like video games or something. So I think one reason why NFTs are so interesting on Solana is because, they're very easy, relatively speaking, on Solana, right? They're cheap. The barrier to entry is quite low. The user experience is comparatively quite good. And for users who aren't sophisticated, patient, crypto investors with a lot of money, it's really the only option. Or if it's not the only option, it's by far the best. And I think Sui and Aptos will be in that same bucket where they provide a great experience for non-crypto natives because of their speed, performance, and they'll provide better options for what users can do because Sui especially is so expressive for these NFT and gaming applications.
Yeah. Wow, okay. So I think, I will definitely link the threads that you've shared together when I publish the podcast. And I think we are moving. It's a good segue to just, because we probably have maybe another 10, 15 minutes on our time cap. I think it's good to just touch on some general items before we head out. Like, some initial thoughts, like how do you see the L2 world playing out on Ethereum? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Something I'm still trying to work out. So I can say what I'm seeing, and then I'm much more uncertain about where things are going. And I think we'll have a much clearer understanding in like 6 to 12 months. So, basically for quite a while, we had the big four. So these were on the optimistic side, and then ZK Sync and Starkware on the ZK side. And these were like the big four players. Maybe there's a few other people behind the scenes, or these like app specific rollups. But what we've seen is that, okay, Optimism and Arbitrum are launched. ZK Sync is coming to mainnet quite soon. Starkware is coming to mainnet quite soon. And now we're seeing this proliferation of like second generation rollups. I don't mean second generation in that they're necessarily, I just mean we're seeing not a few more after this big four. We're seeing a dozen plus new rollups and all these different like iterations. Some of them are integrating with Celestia. Some of them are just direct rollups on top of Ethereum. Maybe they have some like privacy component spun in. Maybe they're like a combination of like Optimism and ZK, or Optimistic and ZK, where they like they have an like optimistic trust for privacy. So something like Polygon Nightfall. So we have and then of course we have the entire Polygon ecosystem. So we're seeing this huge explosion of experimentation in the rollup and volition environment. And yet there's all this hype around rollups, all this hype around, off-chain data availability, the modular blockchain stack. And I think a lot of the hype is warranted. And I think this is a really exciting development. But, I am a bit cautious people are about this technology before really any of it has hit any sort of adoption. Right? Like, people are using Optimism and Arbitrum, of course, but like none of the ZK tech has seen the light of day. So, I do want to be a bit cautious about where things are going, in my perspective on them. But I think what we're starting to see is much more fragmentation. So instead of it just being these four rollups, it's now this huge, all these various rollup experiments, none of which have launched yet. But they're all, well, I guess like some of them are like EVM equivalent, some of them are EVM compatible, others are their entire different, their entire own VM with their own programming language. So we're just seeing a lot of fragmentation at the L2 level. And this is good, right? Like it's good that we have this experimentation, but it makes it quite difficult to see where things are going to actually end up in the long run. So
all right. So the next thing I wanted to quickly ask you was, I know you definitely pay attention to the Cosmos ecosystem. I can see, Appchains are gaining traction. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you see that space evolving?
Yeah, so Appchains are evolving quite quickly. I think about Appchains from a few perspectives. So one is that it seems like a great way for these different applications to find great ways of sort of like adding value to their tokens, right? Like if you're your own L1, there's some reason why the market just gives you like a much higher valuation. And
Mm.
you have some immediate like use case for your token. It's not just a governance token because you can use it to stake and secure the application.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think like one problem that Cosmos faces is that you have IBC, which is like comparatively good as an interoperability protocol, but it still breaks composability much more than if you were on some, say, like high throughput L1.
Hmm.
So that's a bit of a problem, and I think it kind of restricts the design space of Cosmos a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
Time for a lot of applications, it's just more compelling to design their own blockchain. Much more flexibility with their application than merely just having to inherit the design of whatever blockchain they're building on top of. The other problem I see with Cosmos is that I think its performance is fine. Like I think Tendermint is quite good, but it's just not very very good. Like 6 second block time is just like a bit slow. Instant finality is nice, but for real world applications, right? Like if you're a user and you're doing some you know, asset swap, or you're using some like DeFi application, or you're just using a Cosmos blockchain for payments or gaming, whatever you're doing, like 6 seconds just seems like it's a little bit too much time to wait to have a good user
Hmm.
experience. So I'm a bit concerned about Cosmos from a performance perspective, but there are a bunch of developments to make things much quicker, which I'll be following
Hmm.
quite closely. Um, but again, I think the other interesting thing about Cosmos is that the big these monolithic chains have, or even these like just any sort of general purpose blockchain, is that every application that's using that chain is sharing block space.
Mm.
And when you have rapid fluctuations in demand for one application, it can congest the network for all the
Yeah.
other applications. And depending on that application, like just totally hinder its use.
Yeah.
So if you're using Solana for payments, but and you just want some very steady state, but behind the scenes, there's some new NFT mint that's like spiking the gas price.
Yeah.
That's just like totally
Mm.
annoying, right? That
Yeah.
whenever you go to pay for whatever, you have to worry about some stupid NFT collection that's taking all the block space.
Yeah.
So splitting all the different applications up into some Cosmos-like environment where your application's block space is only correlated to the demand for that application at that time seems like a great way of just providing a better user experience for people. So there are a bunch of interesting things about Cosmos, and a bunch of downsides that I see. But overall, like I think it's one of the places to watch.
Hmm.
I like my current model of how things are going to play out is that we're going to see like a power law distribution in terms of like how much value all these different blockchains are going to be worth. And
Hmm.
maybe like Ethereum will be up there, maybe Sui, Aptos, or Solana will be up there as valuable chains. And then you have this long tail, probably mostly of these app specific Cosmos chains that
Mm.
in aggregate are worth a significant fraction of the total crypto economy, but
Mm.
individually are each, comparatively fairly small.
Understood. Lastly, any thoughts on the Tornado Cash situation?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So I'm not a legal expert,
Yeah.
and I was never somebody who used Tornado Cash in any particular way, and I've seen a lot on crypto Twitter, but of course it's hard to parse what is actually going on from just reading crypto Twitter.
Yeah.
I think what I'm more concerned about beyond just Tornado Cash specifically is the second order effects of it, and
Mm.
how it's changing how DeFi applications, and how it's changing how people are perceiving something like USDC, where
Hmm.
a lot of these applications are now censoring users who have used Tornado Cash in some capacity. Like they're blocking their front ends. Of course, you can still interact with these blockchain or these applications. It's just much more difficult. But also,
Yeah.
you have like Circle saying that it's going to have to like freeze the assets of a lot of people who interacted with Tornado Cash, and that's causing a
Yeah.
lot of people to rethink whether they want to use USDC. Saw something from MakerDAO about potentially eliminating their USDC backing,
Yeah.
because if the government comes out and says, okay, it's not just the people who use Tornado Cash, but it's anybody who's using the funds that were used at Tornado Cash at some point, right? And some of that USDC ended up in Maker, ended up in a Uniswap pool or something. A Circle had to freeze those assets. That could be quite catastrophic for those applications. So I think like the second are quite worrying. And then when you also look at how it could impact other privacy protocols, like that's concerning as well. I don't know if it's just because Tornado specifically was used by the Lazarus group or different specific entities that the government didn't like, but at a high level, the privacy that something like Tornado Cash can guarantee is, copied, if not like copied with even more security by like other privacy applications, like like Aztec as a roll up, or I don't even know if I want to name them, but just like other privacy applications. Like, are we just going to categorically eliminate all these privacy applications because we kind of can't do that, in the sense that crypto needs privacy because it's already just so ridiculously transparent. And if we can't have privacy, then it seems like a lot of the selling points and potential use cases of crypto are eliminated or significantly reduced. So it's a really worrying development, but I'm kind of just waiting and seeing, just because I'm really not very clear with like what the government is really thinking here and where they're going to go next.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to unfold on the regulatory side in the coming years. Okay. I think I've taken up quite a generous amount of your time. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning, and I hope you have a good day ahead of you. I will keep you updated when we publish the podcast.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. If people are interested in just like, staying up to date, they can follow me on Twitter. So I'm Trace, TRACE 01. And then, they can